Hello, thank you for coming this evening. It's nice to see so many of you up for debating the death of print, or more broadly, the changes in print media in the face of economic and technological change that's happening in the publishing industry. I'm a curator and a founder of Publishing Me Damned, which is an artist-led publishing network and works on a level far below my distinguished guests around me. It's my pleasure to welcome our three panel members, Roy Greenslade, Andre Schiffrin, and David Roth-Ey, who will be all putting forward some positions on the changes to the industry and also the changes to how writers and editors approach the written word in the current climate. So if I could, we'll begin with statements from each of the panel members to comment on the subject. We'll move into a panel discussion between the members here on stage, and then further towards the end of the debate, we'll open it up to the floor, because I'm sure there's a lot of positions out there that need to be addressed. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Andre Schiffrin, who for 30 years directed Pantheon Books, an independent part of Random House. He left in protest in 1990 to start a not-for-profit publisher, the New Press. This is all described in his book, The Business of Books, published by Verso. And he's recently written a memoir called A Political Education, and a book on the media, Words and Money, just published by Verso, which in some ways forms a centre part of this debate. So, Andre, can I ask you to just put forward perhaps a brief account of the conclusions you drew in your book? That'd be great.
Right, thank you. The book that I've just published here with Verso, Words and Money, is really a comparative international book. It looks at what's happened in Europe, in the US, as well as England. And part of the crisis that I'm describing is much more severe in those countries than it is here, at least as far as we know. We know the difficulties the Guardian is having. It's, I think, 30 million loss per annum. But that's really small pickings compared to what's happened in the US, where two of the major papers, the Chicago Tribune and the Los Angeles Times, are now in bankruptcy. The New York Times had to cut $100 million from its budget last year, Cameron-like cuts, to keep afloat, and is now going to experiment with paywalls. And in France, Le Monde, the most distinguished paper in France, would have not met payroll this summer had it not had a sudden influx of investment money from outside. So the papers are in bad shape, and the publishers in many cases are not in better shape. And the reason of this is a conjunction both of financial as well as technological issues. And I want to stress that because things would not be anywhere near as bad as they are if people had not had totally unrealistic expectations of how profitable words would be. In the US, for years, people expected, stockholders, Wall Street expected newspapers to come up with 26% a year of profit, which is a very, very large amount. Book publishers, increasingly under the control of newspaper and other publishers like Pearson in the US, were expected to no longer make 3 or 4% a year, as they did traditionally throughout the previous century, but to make a 10 or 15% profit. And suddenly, of course, when things began to go bad with the economy, these things began to be much less possible. And in America, the Knight Ridder chain, one of the most impressive of the provincial papers, had the misfortune of making a mere 19.4% the other year, and they were sold off. So you have a situation where people were expecting a great deal of money from fields that were not meant to be that profitable, traditionally, historically, and otherwise. And when the technological problems of having the material come out on the web for free compounded the loss of circulation, then you began to have crisis proportions. And that's partly what I think we need to talk about today, is how we can continue to have the content that we need in any democracy when all of these forces, financial and technological, are against them. Just to give one example, in the U.S., for instance, during the Iraqi war, nearly all of the papers followed the government line. They lied systematically, even when they knew that Bush and the others were lying. And a great deal of the opposition did come on the internet, but it came in part from places like The Guardian, which was the most widely cited of those, because somebody was out there reporting. Somebody was actually doing the job of journalism, of filtering the information, sending people out, spending the money, writing the analyses and so on, without which the internet would have been lost. I mean, even the head of Google, Schmidt, has referred to the internet as a cesspool of misinformation. A cesspool which makes him 25% a year profit, it should be added, and on which he's done very well by quoting the press and not paying them for any of the content that he uses. So the question which I raise in the book, and which I'll raise tonight, is, above all, how do we keep the content? Whether it comes out on the internet in time, whether there's a paywall, or it's just on paper, to my mind is relatively secondary if the material is there. But if the material isn't there, then it doesn't matter what the technology will be. And I think we have only to look back on the hopes and expectations all of our countries had when, for instance, radio started or television started. It was always assumed that that would mean a raising of cultural standards, more information than ever before. When radio was started in the U.S. under that well-known socialist Herbert Hoover, he wanted all the radio stations to be based on campuses of universities, not so that they would be the equivalent of university presses, but simply to make sure that the commercial interests would not take over and distort and determine what they were broadcasting, as they do now. So you have a situation where in every new technology, you've had the hopes, the very high hopes. Those of you in England who are old enough to remember The Listener will know that there was enough on the BBC every week to fill a very intelligent and very interesting weekly magazine with excerpts from what had been broadcast the week before, something which I think would be relatively unthinkable these days. So you have the ever-present struggle between the hopes of technology and the realities when they're taken over by people who are primarily interested in making the most money from them. And that is what's happening with Google, it's what's happening with Amazon, it's happening with the people who are beginning to establish a very clear monopoly on distribution in a way that is extremely dangerous for the content they're talking about. So part of what I talk about in the book is what Europe has done to counteract this, the amount of money that has been spent. The French government last year, even under Sarkozy, spent 700 million subsidizing the press. The French decided, for instance, that they would digitalize their own library holdings rather than let Google do it, unlike the US at this point. They have made efforts, even from the more conservative, even reactionary governments, to maintain some domestic control over the content and over the web. Whether this is possible here, particularly in a time where obviously England is going to pull out of the public support of most everything, and whether it's possible in the US is something we'll have to see in the coming year. But there are other solutions, and I think it's important not to assume automatically that the game is lost, that the papers are going to disappear, that content will be limited to what can be given out in a free newspaper on the evening subway, no matter how successful that may be, and that there is going to be still somehow a role, a traditional role for the Fourth Estate as we've known it all these years.
Okay, well, thank you. That was a fantastic introduction to both your book and some of the issues that we'll raise this evening. Before we move on to questions of content, though, I'm going to move over to David Roth-Ey. He was named Group Digital Director and Publisher for HarperCollins UK in 2010 and is responsible for HarperCollins' digital strategy and publish initiatives across its divisions, including ebooks, apps, audiobooks, e-commerce sites and social media. Prior to this digital role, he has extensive experience in publishing, including positions as the editor-in-chief of Harper Perennial, Quality Paperback Book Club, as well as an editor at Scribner, and a position at the literary agency, International Creative Management. I wondered if you could put forward what the shift in roles, if you like, has been as you've moved into working primarily within a digital environment.
Definitely, thanks. I mean, I think the points that Andre's laid out are really very interesting ones, and I think as we look to the book publishing side, which is in a slightly different position than the newspaper industry, I think there are lots of lessons for us. The book industry historically has been very slow-moving. It certainly was even more slow-moving before the conglomerates got involved and demanding some of the higher margins of return that Andre alluded to. I think the benefit of us moving more slowly has been that we can set and chart a path to try to protect the value of our content by looking at addressing some of the threats that are coming our way. So for one example, in the book side, unlike the newspapers, we've never relied on advertising. And that's proved to be a huge boost to us as we move into the digital side. Our ebook programs are just getting off the ground here in the UK, and the digitization of our content and the ability of us to sell that content is just starting to be seen. I think the key part of our strategy is really to look at the various formats that we publish as a sort of amalgam of the way that people choose to consume. So whether we do end up in a position where print is dead or not, or where it's marginalized to a certain extent, that we build up an infrastructure and a strategy that supports how people want to read, whether it's digitally or in print, in whatever format that is. I think for us in a big publishing house, it's taken a lot of education, a lot of patience to try to move people's expectations of what their job roles are to embrace the digital side. I think that's a key part for us has been to not treat it as sort of a separate new media division that's sort of isolated in a little silo, but rather to try to find ways that we could integrate the digital publishing aspect of our business right at the very start, right at the point of acquisition, working with authors to get them to conceive of how we can enhance ebooks, how we can build apps, how we can really bring their works to a digital audience as well. Just for one final point on that, I think for book publishers, it's sort of ironic that our sort of old school product actually is competitive in an iPad landscape. The iBook store has been relatively successful, certainly very successful for us, and the fact that people are paying for our content. We are actually we found a mechanism and routes to market where we can actually sell our books, where authors are remunerated and publishers do have a future there. I think it's anything but assured. We're going to continue to need to evolve very quickly, but I think on the book publishing side, I think in part because we've been slower to get into that space, we have a lot of advantages in charting a course that gives us more options rather than the newspapers who have probably very few at the moment.
Thank you. I just actually wanted to ask a question before we turn to it. Is there a parallel possibly between your activity in the music industry in that sense of people being of the users who download illegally are often the users who are also buying online?
Well, I think for book publishers, the music industry is definitely a cautionary example for us. I think the fact that the music industry saw the digital marketplace as one that was entirely a threat to them, and that they sued their consumers rather than provide people legal commercial options for them to interact and download music in a way that they wanted to, and they wanted to fill up their iPods. In fact, they sort of shut things down and had a very sort of insular or ostrich-like response. So I think for us, a big part of the book publishing strategy has actually been to digitize our content, to go out and do deals with people who are going to sell our ebooks legally, who are going to use DRM to protect that content, who are going to use territorial restrictions where needed to preserve the value of that content. I think rather than the kind of Wild West that we saw with the music industry, which ended up in the hands of one dominant player, the book industry, very much what we're trying to do is to make sure that there are multiple platforms and multiple players involved. And so far, I mean, looking forward a couple of years, who knows what will happen, but I think we've laid a foundation where we've encouraged a number of partners to be involved in selling ebooks and to try to create a competitive and somewhat balanced landscape that will eventually, I think, stand us in good stead in the future.
Thank you. We'll turn now to our third panel member, Roy Greenslade. Roy Greenslade is Professor of Journalism at City University London, writes a daily blog about the media for the Guardian website, and is the media columnist for the London Evening Standard. He's been a journalist for 45 years, starting on a local weekly newspaper and then a regional evening paper before going on to work in Fleet Street, beginning with The Sun in 1969. He went on to work for most of Britain's national newspapers, including the Daily Mail, Daily Express and the Sunday Times, before becoming editor of the Daily Mirror between 1990 and 91. He is on the board of the academic quarterly, the British Journalism Review. He's the author of 3 books, including a biography of a late press tycoon, Robert Maxwell, and a history of British newspapers entitled Press Gang, How Newspapers Make Profits from Propaganda. He divides his year between Brighton and County Donegal in Ireland. And I'd like to say welcome, first of all, but also we've started to touch on the question of how one maybe extracts money from the consumer within by providing content online. Of course, that's probably most hottest contended within the newspaper industry, and paywalls are now starting to be introduced, most notably from my side, The Times, which seems to be very heavily advertised at the moment in the Tube. I wondered if you could comment a little bit on how newspapers are coping with this shift.
Okay, before I do that, I want to take up some points following on from Andre. It's important to understand, I think, that the reason that we're in a crisis is because newspapers are so heavily linked, unlike books, newspapers are so heavily linked to advertising. And in Britain, which is, I think, very important to see as a specific market, the reason for that is that going back to the 1850s, and I'll not take you through year by year until today, or we'll be here all night, but going back to the 1850s was a period in which finally the British press freed itself from something called what were known locally as the taxes on knowledge, the stamp duty. Newspapers were licensed until that point. And the great moment, the great liberation of that moment was that newspapers would be free, and there'd be something called, and they used it straight away, press freedom. But the freedom, in fact, was always linked to the fact that it would be linked to money, to advertising. So newspapers that didn't get advertising very gradually got thrown away, got moved aside, so that the most successful newspapers, the ones that survived into the 20th century and became so enormous and were the foundations of massive companies, the company indeed which Rupert Murdoch now runs and David works for, that company was founded on the idea that there would be constantly the words that you read every day would be backed up by advertising, and then would lead to the logic, some might say the illogic, of the situation which Andre has described, which is that you would go, if you were going to link it to money, you would go for the biggest possible profits. I can't tell you how the great press barons of the 1930s on to the 1960s lived, in which many of them had hordes of servants in large houses and would have the copy brought to them on trays, silver salvers, and so on. They were vastly rich. And the passing of those barons made very little difference because the companies were largely taken over by corporate enterprises, and corporate enterprises were even more interested into the concept of profit, unlike Rupert Murdoch. And they saw themselves really not as purveyors of news, not as purveyors of public service information, but as simply a business, like no different from baked beans or motor cars, simply a profitable business. And so we reached that crisis point, and this is not a hymn of hate about capitalism, but it is an explanation, I hope, that the link between capital and public service, the link between newspapers as performing a public service and newspapers as profit-making enterprises, meant that when there was a crisis in making profits, there would be a reduction in the use of newspapers. But if that was a big enough crisis anyway. That crisis, by the way, existed well before we had the phenomenon of the internet. The internet has made that crisis all the greater, which is why I say, and I'm not alone in saying, that print in newspapers, not in book terms, by the way, but although, I just ordered a book on Kindle the other day, but not necessarily in book terms, but in newspaper terms, print will die and is in the process of dying. Just look at the circulation figures for local newspapers, regional newspapers, national newspapers, wherever you go, all of those circulations are coming down, and people are instead consuming, those numbers are made up by the fact that people are consuming them on the net. I'm sure most of you consume some news every day on the net. That's the nature of the beast. So if print is dying, and if the only response is simply either as it has been, the response largely has been to say, well, if we're not able now to make profits because at the same time, I've forgotten this little bit of the equation, not only are readers going, of course, to the web, but the advertisers who gave us all that money by supporting our newspapers saying, hey, we're going to the web too. So it's not a case of saying, oh, the net is better than print. There is an argument about that, and we'll come on to that later. But the point is really that the net is now taking away all the money that once supported newspapers. Advertisers are going onto the net because it's much more successful. They can reach more of you. They do it much more efficiently. So with the loss of advertising and the loss of profitability for newspapers, the response from owners has, some would say naturally enough, whether you agree or whether you disagree, is simply to cut back on editorial budgets, to reduce the amount of journalists available to do the job of journalism. And there is there's the essential crisis. The crisis is falling roles of staff, falling amount of quality journalism available, and at the same time, no profitability for the press. That's the reason that print is dying. So, how does one solve that problem? How does one solve that problem? And there, I would say, there is no single answer at all. Murdoch, the greatest visionary, whether you like him or whether you don't, I happen to think he's the greatest media visionary of my generation. The man who saw that we could transmit television by satellite successfully, the man who broke the power of print unions in this country, the man who understood how to turn around loss-making newspapers and make them successful. But now he's confronted with a real problem. He alone has decided that he will erect paywalls at the Times, Sunday Times, next week the News of the World. I'm sure you're all desperate to get onto that. He has decided to erect paywalls, and everyone is watching him carefully. New York Times are thinking about taking the same route, or at least a partial paywall, as they call it, in order to find a way to do the thing that the removal of advertising has robbed us, which is, how do we fund journalism? That's the key thing in my life. I want to be a journalist, well, naturally, it's my life, but I want to be a journalist who's funded, and I want to see other journalists funded. Murdoch's answer is, bring up a paywall and let's see if that works. The Guardian's answer, and I work for The Guardian, the Guardian's answer is, no, there is still the possibility that we can attract enough advertising to our websites, and with the removal gradually of print, which means ending the expensive business of buying newsprint, transporting papers across the whole of Britain, instead everything can be done digitally, at some stage when that moment happens, that great moment happens when you say, no more printing, we'll only go on the net, will you then have enough money through advertising to be able to support the journalism? Because that's what we need to do. And these two very different attitudes, there can be other kinds of paywall, there can be micropayments and other forms of how people might pay, but the answer is, should it remain free, and there'll be philosophical reasons for that too, which we can discuss in a moment, or should it be funded Should it be funded through subscriptions, micropayments, or whatever? And that's the dilemma we are facing, not just like in the future. This is the peril we're facing now. Can we sustain that most important public service ethic called journalism at the same time as funding it? There's the real dilemma.
Yeah.
Okay, well,
by the way, you'll notice I'm drinking alcohol because I'm a journalist. I don't know.
We're drinking gin.
Right. Well, Roy has explained extremely well the links to advertising, which have been essential to the press as we've known it until now. And one of the questions I raise in the book, and I think it's time we raised it in general, is why should this remain to be the case? Advertising gives the illusion, whether it's on television or in the newspapers, that you're getting something for free. Because the ads are being paid for, the papers are cheaper than they would be otherwise, and so on. You know the argument. But advertising is really a private tax. Everything that you see advertised, you pay for. You pay for it indirectly. You pay for it in the higher price of the objects that you buy. But you're paying a private tax, which in turn is the subsidy for the media that we're talking about. And the advertising people have always argued, well, we create a mass audience and therefore we lower prices and so on. But that's nonsense. Anyone who's had to price things, as I've had to price books for 50 years, knows that you're pricing them roughly where the competition is pricing them, and you throw in the 10% of advertising budget as part of your cost. The only objects that are really much cheaper and are mass objects are the very ones that are not advertised. The stuff you buy in a supermarket and elsewhere that has the house brand on it has no advertising whatsoever and therefore is cheaper. But advertising otherwise does not create anything cheaper. So the question is, how do you want to pay for what you need to have? Do you want to pay for it indirectly by the tax on your consumption, or do you want to find other ways? And this is what I'm arguing needs to be done. Now, obviously, the experiments that Roy talked about are going to be very interesting. Can you raise enough money with a paywall to pay for the costs of having 10 reporters in Iraq and Afghanistan? I'm not sure that's going to work. I think Murdoch has proved it works very well with papers that are bought on the expense account. If you're buying the Wall Street Journal, or if you're buying some of his other papers, you can put the costs on the company. Whether that's going to work with the News of the World, I'm very, very dubious about, especially given the amount of free pornography on the web. I'm not sure, that that's going to work. And the New York Times obviously isn't sure, and they've hesitated until now for doing so, precisely because they weren't sure the advertising would cover enough of their multi-hundred million dollar budget each year. So what I'm trying to suggest is that we think really in a different way about all of this. If we agree that newspapers are an invaluable thing, as they were over the years, not as they are necessarily now, with a cut-down staff, with fewer bureaus and so on. The American newspaper industry lost 16,000 jobs in 2008 alone, 10,000 further jobs in the beginning of 2009. They're no longer having foreign bureaus. They no longer even have bureaus in the state legislatures, which are known for their corruption. The papers are no longer covering their beat in the way that they have to if they're going to be a genuine fourth estate, a genuine counterforce in any democratic discussion. So if we agree that we need that, then I think they have to think of other ways. And what I argue in the book is that what was done with the BBC initially was really a very interesting idea. That is, you have a tax on the machine, on the television, that is then funneled to an independent authority that then pays for the coverage the BBC is giving you. And I'm saying, well, if Google is making 25% a year, why not tax them? Why not tax the other access providers? Why not use the taxes that you don't even know you're paying on your phone bill and everything else to help pay for independent coverage in the newspapers and on the radio? The book's situation is a different one, and I'll address that for a minute if I may. But I think the time has come for us to say the 19th century concept that advertising pays for the news coverage, and if you don't have ads, you don't have news coverage, has shown itself no longer to work. And we have to think of new ways if we want to preserve that essential function. Now, as for the books, that's a whole other area, and I'll just mention one thing. The fact that you can now buy on Kindle or whatever, the most recent titles, and they tend to be only the most recent bestsellers, raises two very, very serious problems in the long term for publishing, and I'm sure you've dealt with them. One of them is that the book that you buy electronically is the same price as a paperback, basically, $12.99, $14.99 in the US, which means there won't be a paperback edition. And the paperbacks are what have made the money for the publishers over the years. That's what kept the backlist going. The second thing is, of course, and Amazon and co. are well aware of that, is it'll kill off the bookstores. And the bookstores, for the most part, are already dead and dying. And in America, the chains had managed to kill off just nearly all the independents. When I was a boy and I worked in a bookstore in New York after school, we had 333 bookstores. Now we have under 30, including the book chains, including minus one, the biggest Barnes & Noble that closed the other week. So you have a distribution system that's going to disappear. And that has been in the past the one way in which people could know what the new books were, who the new authors were. I've always argued that a good bookstore is one where you don't find the book you're looking for, but the book you didn't know you were looking for. And that's all going to disappear with the Kindles and others that will be very good at selling you the latest bestseller that you want, the one that is linked to the last television show you saw or whatever. But it's not going to be very helpful in maintaining what we see in the press as well, the difficult long-term book that's going to be around for several years and that explains to you what's really going on. So this is not just, a publisher saying, let's keep things the way they are. It's certainly not an anti-Luddite argument. I think the internet can be extremely useful. But as we saw during the Iraqi war in the US, if you don't have book publishers, if you don't have newspaper publishers going after the real story and counteracting the ever important lies of our governments, you're going to be in real trouble, as we were and are still.
Thank you. David, could I sort of extend that question, some of those issues onto your work? Is that the case within your area? Are you publishing primarily what would be bestseller material from your catalogue? Because Tenton Hudson has traditionally had quite, sorry, Harper.
There's a difference.
Yeah, it's had quite a broad range of titles. So.
Yeah, no, our strategy is absolutely to publish everything digitally. Certainly right now, the front list has been the focus, but we have a big backlist digitization project that's underway. I think the issue there really has been clearing up rights and royalties. There's some vagueness in a lot of those author contracts about how to handle digital editions, so there's been an enormous amount of work that's had to go into that. I would say, though, one of the benefits of ebooks themselves is that once they are available, they never go out of print. So that serious work of scholarship that you were alluding to, that might not be published or wouldn't be discoverable in a digital landscape, I think we will be making those books available on our backlist, and certainly the front list will stay in print. It will be available. Certainly in the UK, on the bookstore question, I think it's enormously important. Our bookstore chains here are under siege even before we had the Kindle. So we had problem. Borders went bankrupt last year, EUK before that. So the fact is that there are enormous strains on the high street already. I concur that digitization and the ebook market itself will only serve to ramp that up and put more pressure on those stores. But I do think that's not the sole cause of it.
I mean, I'm curious about maybe two issues regarding that. There was much discussion about the idea of the long tail, that actually through the e-market, if you like, for books, that there is actually a potential for more fringe publications to be sold and more profit to be made actually from the less well-distributed titles. And that it seems that maybe that theory has not proved to be the case within sales online.
I don't know that that's necessarily the case. I think that actually smaller publishers are much more nimble. They can move quickly, adapt their production methods, and I think for them, the digital marketplace will actually be more promising. I would suspect that, I'd be curious to know from the New Press's side, that you don't have enormous legacy systems, huge investments in warehouses, all the kinds of investment that we've had to have on the physical distribution side. The smaller publishers don't have that. And I think culturally, there's potentially the ability to shift very quickly and adjust to that, whereas in a big institution like Harper, it does take a lot more time and energy to turn that ship in a different direction. So I think there's a lot of opportunities, actually.
I just say I agree with that. I was with a friend. I ran a publishing imprint for a couple of years, and we fell into a disastrous situation because we couldn't get the books out distributed properly. Now I have a friend who's started a small publishing enterprise, and because it's easy, much easier now, you're there on Amazon. I know you might hate Amazon, but you're there on Amazon. Whether you're a Poolbeg, a little publisher in Ireland, or this little publishing company, Revel Barker Publishing, that just does neat little old books about newspapers, they are now being bought in the numbers that would never previously have been conceived. The net enables people to find it, and the net enables people to buy it. So in book publishing terms, the net's been hugely useful to minority publishers as well as what I tend to call, big media.
Well, let me just answer your question. I mean, all of our books at the New Press, which has published about 1,000 books over the last 2 decades, are available digitally, but it doesn't really make that much of a difference. These are not the books that people are looking for on their Kindle. And I think I just mentioned...
That's true.
Right. My own book, which was just mentioned earlier before when we were having drinks, is not available as an e-book.
I looked for it. I was
right.
couldn't find it.
But I'm not basing myself on that. What I wanted just to say is that I think in the UK, and to an equal degree in the US, everyone has accepted the status quo as being inevitable. The book chains, in part, are breaking down and going out of business because the big grocery stores and others were selling Harry Potter for £1 a piece, just to bring people into the store. And that's what happens when you don't have legislation on a minimal price, as they do in Europe. So a lot of what's happening, a lot of the dangers that we all agree exist, are there because of legislative attitudes. In Europe, in Germany, etc., the bookstores are healthy, the publishers are still holding on, partly because there is a fixed price, and you don't have the competition from the big supermarkets that are going to take your 2 or 3 bestsellers a year and use them as loss leaders. People will go beyond that. I mean, in France, and I have a whole chapter on this, because I was surprised at the degree to which everyone was involved, not just at the national level, but even at the regional level, which controls half of the money being spent on culture in France. Bookstores get help. You can get help to start a bookstore. You can get help to continue a bookstore. In my neighborhood in Paris, I saw the other day a sign saying because the local borough administration, the arrondissement, wants to maintain the cultural character of this neighborhood, we're offering this locale to a bookstore for half the rent they would normally pay. So there is partly the feeling that you want to keep bookstores as a center of culture, as part of downtown, as part of a town center, as part of an urban landscape, and the government has a responsibility to help you to do that. Also, I might add, since obviously talking about government responsibility here is of no use whatsoever, there is a major effort in France, which is governmental and private, of having the big publishers give money to a fund to help start new bookstores, help maintain bookstores, help aging bookstore owners find new owners, and so on and so forth. So that you don't have in Paris, if any of you have been in Paris recently or any French city, you don't have the situation you see in London, where you have an ever-decreasing number of bookstores, and the ones that are there are primarily there to sell you paperbacks at a discount. So you have a situation where you have to decide what you want. And then you have to find the policies that will help you do that. And I argue in that respect that what's happening to publishing is a mirror of what's happening in the other media. If you accept the mythology of the free market, that the free market will determine everything, you're going to have a disappearance of most of the newspapers, most of the publishers, most of the bookstores. If you say, no, that's not what we want to find other ways of doing this, and it's not going to cost more because you're simply shifting the way in which the consumer spends his money, then you can maintain things as you want. And I have a chapter in the book on Norway, and I use it because nobody knows anything about Norway outside of Norway, where every newspaper that's a political newspaper gets a government subsidy, and it's not affected at all in what it says. every provincial town that has more than one paper gets money for the second newspaper so that there can be competition on the local level, something which is probably too late to even talk about in Great Britain. So they have used their money, and it's not North Sea oil money, by the way. It's normal money from the normal state budget to say, these things matter to us, and we're ready to pay for them. They've even municipalized most of the movie houses in order to make sure that they could show not just the Hollywood blockbusters, but any of the movies they thought were important. So Norway, 4.5 million people, a tiny country on the edge of Europe, has nonetheless said, we want to have access to ideas, to our cultural heritage, to the best of what's going on in the world, and we're willing to arrange it so that, not necessarily at the cost of the taxpayer, the municipalized cinemas don't lose money, but we have a different structure. And I think, given the real problems that Roy talked about, the time has come for us to say, look, the market has not worked in culture and in media. Let's try and find other ways to make what we think matters work.
I think it's interesting thought. When Alan Rusbridger, the editor of The Guardian, a couple of years ago, raised the possibility of state subsidies for newspapers, particularly thinking of the crisis of local newspapers, which are thought to be really essential to the democracy of local government, there was an outcry. And the outcry is based on the fact, and I hate to go back to the 1850s, but the reason is that we felt we'd freed ourselves from the state. That's the nature of press freedom. We are free from the state, free from political control, free from party interest. And so it's a real cultural problem in this country, a political and cultural problem, to imagine the idea that we could actually subsidize. But, the BBC, we do it at arm's length. If we can find an arm's length method in which to subsidize the most valuable public service broadcaster in the world, and it is, by the way, valuable not just in, I'm not talking about money now, but valuable culturally and politically and socially. I mean, about a third of my students every year come from abroad, and they are appalled to find that the BBC gets so much criticism in this country. Why? Because they absolutely adore it. It's terrific out there, everywhere, except it seems in Britain itself. So if we can find an arm's length way of funding a public service broadcaster, is there not an arm's length way that we could dare to think, that we could fund newspapers and even book publishers? Not that you need it at the moment, certainly not in HarperCollins, but there have to be, now that's the essential point, there have to be new ways of thinking. Most of the really interesting startups in the United States of journalism have been done by philanthropists. I love philanthropists. It's terrific that they're doing it. ProPublica, the Center for Public Integrity, Huffington Post, Investigative Unit, also one over here, the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, funded by two wonderful people who made their money in making scions or whatever. That's terrific. But we don't really think that philanthropy down the road will sustain a big enough, strong enough media to do that. So we have to think, I think, out. I'm never going to use that phrase outside the box. I've just used it. We have to think around the problem that if we've disengaged the funding model for journalism by getting rid of advertising, or that it's leaving us without us being able to retain it, and we don't think that people will physically subscribe to newspapers, is there a way that they can be persuaded to subscribe because it's good for citizens, because it's good for our democracy, through another method like the BBC? I think that's something that's worth thinking about.
I think that raises a very important question, which we can move on to now, which is the question of quality of content, because as your book points out, and I think is quite evident to most people, the proliferation of text online is immense. But the question is, where are things like long-form journalism online? Are they being produced? How are they being funded? Or is the blog a paradigm that it's difficult to escape online?
Well, there's plenty of long-form journalism online. you know, you can turn on to, whether it be the Telegraph or the Times or the Guardian or the Financial Times or the New York Times. There's plenty of stuff. It may be broken up. And the New York Times' famous feature about the phone hacking at the News of the World, it ran for, it's 4,000 or 5,000 words, but it's there online. I read a 4,000-word review of books by Conrad Black today. My head hurt reading Conrad Black. But it's 4,000 words. That's long form to me. It wasn't difficult to read it. We're getting used to that. Reading on Kindle is not a difficult thing to do. Reading on iPads is fantastically easy. So I think the long form is there. It's whether or not we have the journalists to perform the long form work. Now, I think we are at the moment. We are doing that. But I don't think that technology, the new media, the digital age, is ruining the chances of us being able to consume it and us enjoying it. I think we've improved our screens to that point. It's a matter of whether we can fund the people to do it.
Well, I agree, obviously, with what Roy is saying. I do think the figures that we have are not that encouraging. I mean, only 3% of Americans read their newspaper on the web these days, and they spend 8 minutes a day doing so, which is roughly the amount of time you would need to read the front page of the Times. So there is the problem, I think, of attention span. I think very few people are up to the 4,000.
But Andre, did they read newspapers much more than that beforehand?
Well, of course, we don't have figures on exactly who reads what. And, you know, we published Dr. Zhivago, and I figured that maybe, 5% of the people who bought it actually read it. On the other hand, people are not going to read War and Peace on the Kindle. So I think there is a real problem there in that I think we're getting what in America we call the MTV generation. That is, people who are used to short bursts of entertaining stuff, but are not being fed from early childhood the habit of reading at length. And I think it's easier for those of us from the earlier generations to say, yes, of course people will read 4,000 words without thinking twice. I'm not sure the figures sustain that. I also know that, having talked to Huffington recently about her blog, or her post, Huffington Post, they're not making money. Even though they've gone way down market and most of their time is spent on Hollywood gossip. So there is a problem there as to, which of these things are going to be viable financially, which is why I'm arguing, as Roy pointed out, for alternative ways of funding stuff. Now, it doesn't, you can have a major article of investigative nature that is read by relatively few people, but will shake everybody up in Washington. And I think that's something that's important. It has to be there to begin with. In terms of books, let me give one example. My last year at Pantheon, the New York Times has a list of the 10 best books of the year each year, and we had 2 of them, both British books, as it turns out, Cameron Watts' book on how war came and the Garcia Lorca biography of Gibson. Both of those books had been commissioned 25 years before. Now, you need to have a certain amount of pressure from your not pressure from your accountants who will tell you write it off. That money's lost a long time ago. Don't hold on to the contract. It's a waste of time. But also the very fact of time. You need time for a book to be written. You need time for people to know about it before it's returned from the bookstores the next week. You need time to read the 4,000-word article, even if it's on the web. And time is something that is no longer readily available in the system that we have, where people in bookstores judge on how much money per square foot you make per minute, and you send the book back the following week if it hasn't made that amount of money. So we have these factors. I mean, we are living in a thoroughly capitalistic economy where every factor down the line, whether it's how much money each editor makes in a publishing house, whether it's a question of how many ads the paper can get, or how quickly the books will sell, all of those are determined on short-term, quick profitability. And unless we begin to change that and come up with other standards, I think we have every reason to be pessimistic.
And David, are you finding you're having to look at different types of formats for publishing online?
Definitely. I mean, to the point of long-form journalism, one thing that we're looking at, because I agree, I think alternate sources of funding, it's a really interesting idea that's in your book, and I think it's certainly worth reading. I do think we need to get back to the point that for it to be successful, we're going to have to get people to pay for the content. I think readers themselves are also going to need to pay for quality content. We're setting up a process using the ebook model to kind of break away from the book and go down to smaller chunked up content, be it short stories or working with journalists who've done a long form piece, say in the Sunday Times, expanding that and selling that on the Kindle, on the iPad, on the iPhone and other platforms. So finding a way, if there's an article that's bouncing around that is being discussed, and if there's an extended version of that, that whether it's policymakers or people who want to be in the know are willing to pay 59p for, we're working to create a mechanism by which we can get them to actually buy that. It'll be well edited. It'll be optimized for their device. They can use it across multiple devices. So making that excellent content available across multiple devices, we think we can get people to pay for that content. And I think that needs to be another aspect. And I think the book publishing side has a role to play in potentially bridging that gap between journalism and full-fledged books. Amazon themselves have, I think, recognized that marketplace. They've just announced something I think they're calling Kindle Singles, which is basically very much that. I think they're talking 30,000 to, or maybe 10,000 to 30,000. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but maybe longer form journalistic pieces that they would envision selling to Kindle consumers. So again, it's a new marketplace for that content. It gets away from the dependency on ads, and I think it's something that's worth exploring.
I think one of the fantastic advantages of the net, which is true of both journalism and books, is the relationship between the creator and the public, the creator and the citizen, in which you cut out the middle people. Because I've never really been convinced that newsagents, now they're supermarkets largely, do a very good job of marketing newspapers. I've never really been convinced that bookshops do a very good job of selling books most of the time. So I actually think it's good to cut out the middleman to an extent. I remember when I wrote my biography of Robert Maxwell, and I couldn't find it in a bookshop. And I complained to an agent who I happened to be at a launch with, and he very haughtily said to me, "We really try to keep authors out of bookshops. They're so disruptive, so annoying." And that sort of that attitude that really it doesn't matter that much at bookshop level and so on and any middleman, to be absolutely honest, is something that the net can help us to overcome.
Well, also it finally gives us a means to capitalize on impulse shopping. That if you read a review, if you hear someone discussing a Malcolm Gladwell article about the impact of social media, you can go there and get it immediately. And I think that's of enormous value for book publishers, not having to wait to go to Waterstones, not having to wait till it opens, seeing if they have a deep enough stock selection. All of those things, we lose sales all along the way. So I think from a book publishing side, obviously I'm playing the glass half full, although I'm drinking the most here. I think that's a real benefit.
Just before I remove myself and allow the speakers to speak directly with you as an audience, and we go to questions, I just want to come back to the idea of a foundation supporting publishing for 1 second, and this idea of public funding of culture more broadly, because there is in some ways a division between what one might say the publishing world is, compared to the arts and theatre. And do you feel that there might be some kind of coming back together of those two different ways of delivering art forms to the public? Any comment?
Oh, well, right now, no. I mean, look, they're robbing, they're taking away your arts funding. So, I mean, they're certainly not going to say there's a commercial activity called book publishing, there's a commercial activity called newspaper publishing. Let's get involved there, when they're already taking away from desperate need for art. So I don't see in the current climate, this particular government especially, because I think it's ideologically driven, they're not, their view is the market can decide. And what we're all saying in various ways, probably not, David, I won't be unfair, is that the market can't, in many ways, perform the task as well as concerned citizens engaged with and understanding why it's important to preserve newspapers, books, reading matter, information, knowledge, and so on. Thank you. Maybe I'm wrong.
Well, I'm sure there might be some questions or comments related to that or other issues out in the audience now. I can't see the person with the microphone.
Is there an audience there?
Yeah, it's really dark out there, but I can see a hand sort of fourth row down in the top to the end.
Good evening. I've been thinking about this question that I'm about to ask more in relation to magazines than in terms of books or newspapers. But I guess we've been imagining a future where it will no longer be necessary or perhaps even possible to print a content on paper. So if that's the case, then will it be necessary for the image to be still? And is it possible that the days of photography are numbered?
Yes. I mean, I think still photography. I mean, there's a whole site, a photographer's site, dedicated to debating this all the time about whether still photography does have a future. It's interesting you mentioned magazines because in many ways, magazines are niche products. They segment the audience very well, and that's why they've survived quite well. But you can now see that the biggest publisher in this country is IPC Media, which is owned, in fact, by Time Warner in the States. And IPC is shedding, week on week at the moment, magazines, because they're not considered any longer to be profitable, because there's not enough, well, we've said it before, there's not enough advertising to support them, and they are labor-intensive to produce. And so previously, this idea you could get small, very profitable niches is drifting away. I mean, they are still making profits, but, you know, Andre's point is that for them, for the people that really, the investors, the profits are not good enough. So I think that high quality, we're going to see a drifting, if we're seeing a drifting away from newspapers and problems created in terms of books, we're also seeing that crisis happening in magazines too. And the first thing that will happen is in terms of photography, you know, one of the most famous magazines is Geographic magazine. They used to fund photographers to fly across the world. That's not happening any longer. And in fact, freelance photographers are in some crisis, as I pointed out.
Well, again, you know, what we've seen in recent years is that magazines were created because there was thought to be enough advertising to pay for them to reach a given audience, whether it's fishing magazines or gun owners or whatever. That was a total distortion of the original idea, which was you did a magazine because you had something to say and there were people who were interested in what you had to say. Now, the solution, in part, if there is a solution, is partly the National Geographic is a not-for-profit magazine. It's one of the few American magazines that has been in that category for years and has worked very well. And The Guardian and The Observer, as you know, belong to the Scott Trust. I mean, there are solutions to having not-for-profit publications that take away some of the pressure. It doesn't take away all of the pressure, but most of the newspapers in Canada, in Denmark, some of the German papers are all owned by not-for-profit foundations, and that can be the case for magazines as well. It's the case for the New Press. When we started it 20 years ago, after I left Random House, we decided we would have a not-for-profit structure precisely so that we could publish the books that we thought mattered. We don't have to make 15 or 20% at the end of the year. If we break even, we're happy. And I think that's the case with many other of the structures. Now, just to go back one more step, is that there used to be considerable public support for books and magazines through the public libraries. This was understood to be part of the role of the state in buying a reasonable number of copies. When I remember when Victor Gallant used to visit me in New York, he always would order 1,500 copies of a book, whether it was a critique of the economy by Gunnar Myrdal or a mystery novel by Cherval and Vallot, the predecessors to Mankell. And one day I said, why always 1,500? And he said, because I know I can sell 1,500 to the libraries. Now, this was not boasted of as a subsidy to publishing, but that's in effect what it was. It was also a subsidy to the readers, because people were able to get in the libraries, whether it's on Kindle or not, the new books that were coming out, not just the bestsellers, as is now the case in most libraries in the English-speaking world. So I think, again, we have to realize that what's falling to pieces now, and it is falling to pieces, is not the way things always were. It was only in recent years that magazines became simply targeted at whoever you could sell the advertising to. And the relationship, the most striking example of that relationship is probably the biggest of the German papers, the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, the other year sacked half of its staff because advertising had gone down that year. So you have a model in which, the basic coverage, whether it's cultural or political or whatever in a given country, is based on the question of advertising. And as I'm arguing repeatedly, I'm afraid, this is something that we have to think of giving up. It isn't working. And what we're getting is the shadow of what we used to have. And as I say, it's not just a question of vanity. It's really an essential thing, as we've seen in America in recent years, to the functioning of a democracy. Because if we let governments lie without checking them, they will lie their heads off.
As if they're not making profits. The chief executives are still earning $500,000 a year, plus bonuses, plus extra pension funds. They're still okay. But what we're doing is killing off journalism because it's so tied to that business.
Responses to part of my question, but the other part of my question was about the digital image being potentially liberated from the physical limitations of paper. Do you think that some sort of moving image clips might replace still photography?
Yes.
Certainly within the ebook world, we are using multimedia content in our ebooks as the ebook standards can support that. So we're definitely we're publishing Russell Brand's new memoir, and in that, the standard book has a regular plate section. The ebook versions that we have him speaking to you. It has him. There's a comedy skit. There's him talking to a sex therapist. So we've actually incorporated multimedia content within the ebook.
I mean, I think that raises another interesting question, which is actually some of the crisis in the print media, or possible crisis in the print media, to do with convergence of media rather than that is squeezing out the written word, if you like. I read recently a report in The Guardian, I think, that something like 40% of people under 20 are uncomfortable writing with their hand. They're so used to the keypad.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I think that if you look at most newspaper websites, they have a lot of video material, a lot of audio material. And indeed, when I was talking to a News International executive yesterday at lunchtime, he was explaining that one of the theories behind the idea that they're going to attract an audience to the News of the World website, which goes behind a paywall, which has just gone behind a paywall this week, is that what will be the big lure for people will be video content. I wouldn't like to advise anyone to look at that video content, but it's clear also that serious newspapers, The Guardian and The Telegraph and The Times, all carry lots of video content, as does The New York Times.
It does,
yeah. The next question, there's a gentleman here, fourth row back, with the dark hair.
That doesn't make it a bad thing.
Hello, thank you very much for your talk. I was just wondering, looking at the global perspective in Asia, in South Korea and Japan, the internet doesn't seem to have reduced the habit of reading.
Technology.
I ought to explain that my grandson put this damn thing on my iPhone. It causes me nothing but embarrassment.
I'm sorry, I think you might have to repeat some of your questions.
Yeah.
You're so distracted.
Okay. Yeah, in South Korea and Japan, the internet doesn't seem, going online doesn't seem to have reduced the habit of reading newspapers and books to the same extent that it has in Britain and the US. Does the panel have any response to that? Does it have any perspective? Do you agree or disagree? Or if you agree, what explanation do you have?
I have a long thing in my book on the Asian figures, which are amazing. I mean, the largest paper in Japan sells 14 million a day, the second largest 12 million. And the papers that are increasing their sales the most rapidly are those in China and India, which is, they are not surprising. They have a new middle class that's going to buy papers. But one of the interesting things about the Western press is they never ask any questions about anyone else. They say, yes, the death of the paper is inevitable because the New York papers are in trouble or the British papers are in trouble. I've yet to see a single article on why the Japanese papers are doing so well. And I think this is an interesting question, as how badly the press covers the press. Because we have phenomena that are clearly counterindicative as far as Asia is concerned. And we have, at least I've not seen a single thing in any of the papers that I read that has even tried to explain why Japan has as many video games and many pornographic websites, etc., as we do. In spite of that, you know, people are still reading papers.
Well, I take that as a personal attack on myself as the media commentator for The Guardian. The answer, by the way, is we don't know. It is unique. I mean, I think we must understand cultural specificity here. I mean, it is an amazing thing in Japan. But I think, and is different from everywhere else. They're well up on the technology, and yet these papers, morning and evening, selling these vast numbers. Although, by the way, there are recent signs that there are problems. But anyway, it is unique. And we don't know the reason, and we've investigated the reason. Don't think we don't. But we can't discover why it is. People just seem very happy to go on consuming both in print and online. As distinct from, say, India, Brazil, China, and what we used to call the Soviet Union, but now calls itself Russia, but acts like the Soviet Union. Anyway, that's a different point. That is simply the case that they started from a point where they didn't have a press and are now getting a press, and they are not yet reached that stage of having wide broadband capability, so they are enjoying, and Andre's right, as a burgeoning middle class comes up and an aspirant working class, they are doing what the British and Americans did the century before. So it's not linear, I mean, this development of the press. But what we could, so in other words, while we've been in a state of decline, which, as I say, predates the internet, the gradual, and this has profound cultural reasons and economic reasons, I think, about, and political reasons, I think, about us feeling safe in the West. You know, people read newspapers when they were under threat, read newspapers when they didn't seem to know enough. We also have a fantastically highly developed media. We have 24-hour radio, 24-hour television. News comes through in Western society almost by osmosis. But that's not true in developing countries. And so I think that they are developing, and you'll see the press, and are seeing the press, take off in those countries. But all that will mean is a shorter time span between the takeoff of the press and its gradual decline.
So 3 rows back to Rodney. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Hi. We've been talking a lot about the internet and paywalls, digitisation, iPhone apps, iPads. Technological changes seem to happen really fast. Are you looking ahead to how things might change in 5 years' time, for example? The new technologies, what might be the new forms of content and platforms, how people might consume content, and what the solutions to the challenges might be?
David, perhaps.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's a great question. I think it's because so much of the change is driven by technology firms, not by content firms, it can be a bit harrowing to try to envision what might be on the horizon. I think for us, fundamentally, it's putting in an infrastructure and a business model that can adapt to those changes. Creatively, though, within our teams, what we've done is put digital editors within the divisions, is to not treat it as a separate part of the business at all, but rather to sort of incorporate it from within. Because I think where the real innovation is going to come from, at least on the content side, is really by the editors, the marketers, the publishers working with authors at the inception of the product, whether it's a book or an app or whatever it is, to see all the ways that that can be developed and to really control those different aspects, as opposed to creating something that then the technology companies just get their hands on and can run over. So I think it's hard to know where they're going, but I think what we can do is set up a structure to try to anticipate that and be more creative in our own publishing.
I think it's impossible. I feel a bit, a Donald Rumsfeld moment coming on here about unknowns, because you can't forecast exactly what's going to happen. I went to see that film, The Social Network, the other day. I mean, it seems weird that Facebook took off in the way that it did. We now stand back and see, oh, yeah, that was quite clever. Not that Mr. Zuckerberg seemed to know what he was doing at the time. And I guess Napster started in the same kind of crazy way. Even Amazon and even Google. These are... and, of course, the hardware. We couldn't have conceived of the iPad 3 years ago, 4 years ago. We knew there were e-readers out there, but we didn't know that Kindle and iPad would be so incredibly easy to use and so efficient. So, we can't know. I think it's really interesting that the Daily Telegraph decided to set up a unit in Euston a year or so ago and said, there you are, Mr. Lewis, former editor of the paper. You go off with 50 people and think where we're going. And so Mr. Lewis, of course, got sacked, and he's gone, and the Euston project has been moved in-house, and the people have disappeared, because thinking the future in that way, in that kind of mechanical way, doesn't necessarily work. And the most important thing that we've noted from the development of technology is that it's the single idea by the geek in the university that works, that develops something new. And so we can't know. We can't possibly know. We can do what David said, which is try and prepare the ground, but in a sense we don't know what the next thing is around the corner.
Perhaps ironically, one could also suggest look back 50 years at what Star Trek came up with, because that seems to be the model for much of the hardware.
I forgot about that.
But, so perhaps actually what David's publishing holds the imaginative key. There is a question just straight across on the side, 2 minutes.
Hi, my question is basically, I'm just curious to know your thoughts on the publishing model that Nick Denton at Gawker Media has built on. I mean, I know that you've been talking about cultural changes and how we have been able to adapt, but he's changed the way journalists work. They get paid per hits. He's changed the way we read. We have, and I feel like a snarky journalism is more pervasive now than it was before. And so I just wanted to know how your thoughts on how you think that type of publishing has affected the industry as a whole, if you think it's negative or positive, or just your general thoughts on it.
Again, perhaps I can turn to you first. David, I mean, you've obviously adopted quite a traditional format, but were other formats considered in terms of payments?
Yeah, I mean, I think I consume Denton as a consumer, probably not as a book publisher, so it's probably more an answer for Roy to answer. I mean, I'm guilty of checking Gawker and Defamer and others. I mean, I think it's an interesting that he's so successful within those niches, but then brings niches across horizontally. So I think from a book publishing side, that's a very interesting model that digitally we'll be able to find people within niches, but then try to connect them across those niches where we possibly can. But I think Roy probably has more.
Well, I think the Gawker phenomenon, not that it's a phenomenon, I shouldn't really, Nick would love that if I said that, wouldn't he? But the Gawker thing is no different in a sense from what we've seen developed in print, with Page 6 in the New York Post or Bizarre in the Sun or whatever. It's a little niche operation which is full of gossip, and we need to read it if we're in our form of media. And many people find they need to go to Matt Drudge, God knows why. Here's a man who actually says 50% of what I publish is true. And Guido Fawkes, for instance, the political blogger in Britain who's very successful. These little niche operations, by the way, once existed in-house in big media. The nice thing is that they can be through startups now. And Media Bistro is very good as well, by the way. So I think those are little things that I think you can do on the net that you couldn't easily do in newspapers because you'd always have a controlling editor and a controlling person. You can be naughtier on the net than ever before. And although I think, to be honest, Gorka's quite responsible. It's not that outlandish. He's found a middle way. But I don't think it's a development that's really fantastically significant, to be honest.
Well, let me look at the darker side of this for a minute, for a change. Because, we have now in America the phenomenon that like 23% of the country thinks that Obama is a Muslim, that he was born overseas, and so on. So you have what Schmidt called the cesspool of misinformation being used very sophisticatedly, very carefully by political extremists who know they can work under the mask of anonymity, spread endless lies, and get away with it. The Chinese government has hired hundreds of people who work simply on the internet trying to counteract the effect of the pro-democratic forces that are using the internet as well. So it's not just a factor of the extreme right in America.
Are you blaming the technology for that?
No, of course I'm not.
Because I think
I'm not blaming the technology.
In the days when newspapers were covertly used in Britain, the same thing was going on. We might say that newspapers that are privately owned and those owners have their own views and the editors have their own views roughly do the same thing. And anyway, the most pervasive force in America is Fox News, which is not concealed from anyone, but is out there doing it.
No, of course, but I'm not saying that the internet is doing stuff that hasn't been done before. I'm saying it's doing it very effectively, and it's doing it partly effectively because people are used to the anonymity of the people who are writing. And there's no correction, there's no letters to the editor, there's no attempt to say, wait a minute, you just said something that isn't true. So you have the problem that as all technologies in the world's history can be used in different ways. The Chinese example, I think, is a very interesting one that's inadequately covered by the foreign press, by the way. There are all sorts of ways of using the internet in a way that is useful for your political aims, no matter how nefarious they may be. And now, in America, you have so many crackpots who are running for office that you really don't even need the lies on the internet. They'll come out from the candidates themselves. But it does lead to a lowering of the standards. Now, in a different way, as Roy was just saying, Sarkozy is trying very hard to get the leading French manufacturer of warplanes to buy yet another newspaper. Dassault owns a third of the French press as it is. They now want to buy the Paris equivalent of the Evening Standard, the Parisien, because Sarkozy thinks rightly that that might help shift the election in his way, and he's using his influence with Dassault, and it's a mutual relationship, to buy the largest independent paper left in the country. So the old methods still work. I'm not saying that you can't use the press. And Berlusconi without, that's the most obvious example, and maybe one of the reasons why the Italians are so happy to subsidize the press. But we have a situation where it's not just the Russians who are using the press in that covert fashion. It's something that's widespread, and it expresses again the need for an independent counterforce to exist, and I might say also for better coverage of the press. I'm sorry.
We had a question here, if I'm right.
Hi, I have a question specifically for Mr. Schiffrin. I really would like to know if Cameron was to come up to you and ask you what legislation would you recommend? You mentioned subsidies for bookstores or independent publishers. Are there a couple, 2 or 3 things that you would say I would recommend for this to be done or considered? Yeah.
Well, that is a hypothetical question, if ever there was one. But I think, at this point, England is not going to look to Europe and to see what's being done on the continent to deal with these issues, which I think is unfortunate, because, as I said, even conservative governments, and Sarkozy is probably more of a Tory than Cameron is, have decided that there are certain things that they have to do to keep the culture going and to keep the press available. And 700 million last year is not an insubstantial amount. Part of what they're doing, by the way, is offering free subscriptions to any paper you want to 200,000 youngsters. Yeah. Now, that's obviously something that's unthinkable here, but the attempt to try and get young people to begin to read the press again is an interesting experiment. And those 200,000 slots were filled within a day or two. So, it's not just getting, and the free papers in France have been as effective as the Evening Standard. I mean, the younger people are willing to read paper if it's made available in ways that it makes sense to them. So those are all things that can be done. I think the other question, as I was trying to explain earlier, is that the whole question of what's left of an urban culture is something that has to be thought about, and I think bookstores are part of that. I mean, when I go to British provincial cities, I'm appalled by the fact that it's always exactly the same shops on the high street. This is something that just doesn't exist in Europe, where you have infinitely more variety, and you certainly don't see independent bookstores left on the high street because Waterstones, which is Smith's, has done away with most of them, as has happened in the case in the U.S. So I think there are a lot of things where municipal governments can make an effect, though those are being destroyed here as well. There are all sorts of ways where you could use the rhetoric of Cameron of saying, let's build co-ops. Fine, let's have cooperatively owned newspapers and bookstores. That's certainly something that's possible. And maybe the state would be willing to lend some money to startups in the co-ops, in the co-op world. I can think of very few people I know in publishing who would not be infinitely happier working for a co-op than working for a conglomerate, which is forcing them to do, for the most part, stuff that they don't believe in anymore. So there are possibilities. The question is to try and open up a debate, and obviously in England at this point, it's very difficult. But I'm glad you asked the question.
Can I say just a tangential point to the homogeneity of our high streets is one of the reasons that advertising has retreated from our regional and local papers, because there's no local retailers, no local little businesses, as there are in France, as there are in Italy, as there are in Germany. All our high streets look the same. All of them are national, international companies, and they don't advertise in the local paper. It's a real crisis.
Okay, we've probably got time for one more question, one or two more questions. Is there any? I thought I saw a hand, but it was a cameraman. Yeah, Dan. Yeah.
Hi. Sorry. If you look at things like the Hay Festival franchise, that's very successful at monetizing highbrow experiences. Or if you think about tools by Malcolm Gladwell, that's also very successful. If you think about things like John Lewis or Barcelona Football Club, they're quite successful alternative business models. So my question is, do you think that the leaders of media organisations are lacking in business vision? And to connect to that also, can The Guardian really survive just on advertising on the net, considering that there's massive supply? I mean, surely they have other plans as well?
Well, I mean, I think newspaper companies, thoughtful newspaper companies, are desperate to find new business models. And one of the ways they're going about it, and the Hay Festival reminds me of that, is that they are trying to form readers' clubs. Telegraph is doing this, the Times is doing this with Times Plus, and The Guardian is extra, as they call it. And they are trying, therefore, to say, we have a unique audience, it's segmented, which is one of the problems of all newspaper audience. There's this group that buy the paper for this reason and this group for that and so on. And how can you please all of them? One of the problems of our newspapers has always been, because they're general newspapers, unlike the Wall Street Journal or the Financial Times, which have got niche audiences and niche audiences that need to have that information, how can we monetize more general information? And the answer is to try and form clubs around those. And I think that there isn't yet an easy and successful business model, but I think that many of the publishers, The Guardian and The Telegraph, from different ends of the spectrum, and The Times, are trying to think of ways of saying, we have this unique brand, which is the title, the history. How can we find ways, given that our readerships are drifting away, given that money's drifting away, how can we retain people's interest? Can we build little business models within the brand to try and bring them ahead? And I think that's going forward. It's not yet at all successful. It's something they're thinking about and working on.
Is that something, I guess the issue of a brand, the headline brand, if you like, of The Guardian is quite different from in a book publisher where presumably the author is more the selling point, is that?
Exactly. I mean, it's a good point, though. I think the Malcolm Gladwell example is certainly something. David Sedaris. There are authors who have a brand where you can try to create an experience around that author in the way that in the music industry, the art of the live acts are really where the money is there. So I think from the book publishing side, we're looking at those opportunities, but for the most part, publishers themselves don't really have a brand that we could actually organize something like that around.
I might add that you used to in England.
Yes.
At last count, Random House UK had 28 formerly independent publishing houses subsumed within it. Now, whether it's Chatto and Windus or Secker or whatever, it doesn't mean anything. It's just a stamp that they put on the spine. But there used to be a case where if you knew a book of literary criticism came from Chatto, you knew what that meant. And you had the same with nearly all the other publishers who had a real reputation. It wasn't called a brand in those days, but it existed. The problem now, of course, is everything is homogenized into the same machine with the same profit pressures. And once you have that, you can try and make money out of your best-selling authors, but your name doesn't mean anything anymore.
One good example would be the Faber Academy. You've got Faber and Faber. They've set up a writing academy. We've created a website for self-published authors or unpublished authors called Autonomy, and through that we've set up writers' workshops where we bring in people who have written manuscripts to meet with authors and editors to talk about the editing process and cover design. So we're doing some of that. It's just, for us, it's not really scalable. I think for Faber, they've been really quite successful with that. But they do have that standout brand that means something to people.
Okay, well, unless there's another pressing question, I'd just like to thank this evening's panel. Doesn't look like it. Yeah. No hands shot up. Okay, well, thanks to all of you for taking part in this discussion. It's been very interesting. Thank you all for coming.